Thank you, Dave. Much appreciated. In 2023, the Lake Superior Committee tasked the Tech Committee with evaluating the current strain of coastal brook trout that we have in the hatchery system for stocking into Lake Superior, as well as identifying potentially new sources of brood stock that could provide a different strain for future stocking events. So this is a continuation of somewhat of that work in Minnesota waters, as well as a need to identify a new broodstock source potentially, since the current one is going to be decommissioned in the near future. Coastal brook trout are culturally important, socially important, and recreationally important in Lake Superior. We have an FCO for coastal brook trout. We have a coastal brook trout rehabilitation plan. And state agencies with management plans use these other plans as like sideboards for management, right? So our Minnesota Fisheries Management Plan has things regarding coastal brook trout in them as well. One thing that we did in Minnesota, Nick Peterson, this is Nick Peterson's work. I'm just presenting it. Nick is awesome. He's a rock star. He worked with local steelheading groups, Minnesota Steelhead being one of them, coming up with a steelhead genetics project to help us look at introgression of various strains and wild fish that we were seeing in Minnesota waters. And of course, that wrapped up. We got some nice work out of it that's helped us to guide our management, our stocking efforts. And so then the next logical step was let's apply this to our native coastal brook trout. So we came up with the coastal brook trout genetics project, working with the same group of folks, working with many of the same anglers. And it's great having anglers helping you out. A lot of the rivers on the North Shore of Minnesota have waterfalls. At the bottom of these waterfalls are huge pools, deep pools that we can't access with our electrofishing gear. So working with anglers who are able to fish below these barriers and in these deep spots really helps us to collect genetic information that we wouldn't have gotten otherwise. And we've had some really nice work through the Meek Lab and Nadia Mamuzadeh working on coastal brook trout genetics in our waters. Anglers can catch bigger fish than we can. So anglers are catching a lot of those larger sized fish that we had never seen in our surveys before. And they were catching many larger coastal brook trout through time that we just didn't see in our electrofishing surveys. We thought maybe they weren't there. They were there. So this is a 25-inch coastal brook trout in Minnesota waters. The other great thing about anglers is, can we hit the video on that maybe? Excellent. Other great thing about anglers is you get to meet some very, very passionate anglers. And this is Chris Carlson. He's a young angler that is very passionate about brook trout fishing, and he provided us maybe with video. He provided us with video. We'll see if it works. No, maybe not. Well, I'll tell you what it was. Okay, it's kind of losing the thunder here, but what this would have shown was a male and a female on a spawning red, very shallow water, like think a 1.5 feet deep water, spawning along the shore of Lake Superior. There's 6 or 7 other adult brook trout around this spawning pair, and as the spawning pair spawns and releases gametes, all of these other brook trout go in and eat all the eggs. Not all of the eggs, but the majority of the eggs, right? Even the male and the female that did the spawning ate the eggs as well. So, interesting. Makes us wonder why rehabilitation hasn't come across yet. But yeah. So in this population that we knew because we had anglers out there fishing, we wouldn't have known about it otherwise. We said we should probably get a closer look at the population estimate if we are ever going to, in the future, potentially use this for any sort of hatchery operation. So our crews went out in some gorgeous northern lights and were able to do a lot of electrofishing thanks to the Grand Portage Band for your assistance in this work. It's truly appreciated. So looking at our shoreline spawning assessment that we already have set up from our June work, we just repeated those transects. We did pit tags in each fish that was collected. We did 4 sampling events from October into November. And what we came up with was a population estimate of 300 plus adult brook trout over 12 inches using shoreline spawning habitat in a shallow protected bay in Minnesota waters. Looking at maturity, we see that the 4 spawning or the 4 sampling events, October 19, October 30th, November 10th and November 18th, we see we hit it fairly well with pre-spawn, active spawning or peak spawning, and then post-spawn as well. So we've got some really nice data on the length of this spawning event for these fish. This population now we know is highly susceptible to anglers and shoreline disturbance. Like I said, they were spawning in 1.5 to 2 feet of water very near shore. You can see them actively spawning where they are. So we're reevaluating kind of maybe making this a protected sanctuary for spawning brook trout. Just because it is so susceptible to angling pressure and also for environmental conditions like either ice, which we had this year, or lowering lake levels. Looking at the thermal habitat during the spawning event, we see that the spawning event really did line up with kind of that 50-degree water temperature where we saw that active spawning first occur. Peak spawning, and then late spawning as those temperatures started to decline. Now we have Dr. Lauren Miller at our genetics lab at the University of Minnesota, and he can rapidly turn around some genetic workup for us. So this is microsatellite data. Each of those bars is a single coaster brook trout, and what we had seen, and this is from fall of 2025 again, that the majority of the largest brook trout in this survey were Nipigon strain fish. Those blue bars are what we would consider our Minnesota genetics coaster brook trout, and the orange bars there are the Tobin Harbor stocked strain of coaster brook trout in Lake Superior. So it was really interesting to see those larger brook trout coming up as Nipigon strain fish. Now, we also did some, in part of this brood stock replacement effort was to determine whether or not, we could operationalize something like this. So we also did some brood stock collections from streams. I tasked my team with angling for coaster brook trout for this effort. It was a 2-day effort, and they were able to catch 58 brook trout within 2 days. Smaller than what we would have seen out in the lake. But then it was just, can we operationalize and make this work if we have to? And I think we were able to prove that we could do it if we needed to. And looking at the timeline events here, just October 8th to 9th, fish were captured. We kind of went through how many eggs per female. And, with staff limitations and us having to do other work, we could not really finish. We wanted to spawn these fish to see whether or not we could come up with a good eye-up rate and a hatch rate and everything else, but we just ran out of time, so we put those fish back in the rivers that they came from and moved on with our fall sampling. Redcliffe also did very similar work in the Little Sioux and Thompson Creek. They were able to backpack electrofish 26 females from the Little Sioux, 23 from Thompson Creek. And again, getting an egg rate, 5,000 eggs, 4,500 eggs. So a lot of really good work from, again, our Lake Superior Tech Committee folks in trying to, accomplish those tasks that the committee has put in front of us. And that's what I have. Any other information or questions you might have, Nick's email is up there, and I'll take questions if anyone has them.
Questions from the committee? I've been watching for